We're going to pick up with the 1928 presidential election. So Calvin Coolidge had finished out his own term, having previously finished Harding's term. And this time around, 1928, the Republicans choose as their candidate Herbert Hoover of Iowa. Herbert Hoover, a former mining engineer who had actually gained quite a bit of good press and goodwill at the end of World War I, because he had overseen efforts to try to help refugees rebuild and supply food and so forth, refugees in European countries after World War I. The Democrats chose as their candidate Al Smith of New York. Al Smith was he was significant beyond the fact just that he was that year's Democratic candidate. Al Smith is historically significant because he was the first Catholic person to receive the nomination of one of the major parties to run for president. As you can see from the map, however, the anti-Catholic bias of the time, coupled with the fact that, as we talked about before, the 1920s was a very conservative decade, worked against it. He didn't do well at all. You'll notice that he didn't even win his own home state of New York, though he did carry Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And notice this, other than Florida, the Deep South, Florida, of course, kind of a special case now, and it was becoming so. It was becoming so by the 1920s. Sort of like northern Florida is southern, southern Florida is northern. Anyway, the deep southern states all went with Al Smith, which reinforces the thing that we've talked about several times, that the Democratic Party was so strong in the South for such a long time. It was called the Solid South, and this was the case all the way really up until the 1980s. It was so strong that despite the anti-Catholic bias, Southerners in these deep South states voted for a Catholic Democrat rather than vote for the Republican. This is going to, as I said, this is going to change over time, but it's going to take a long time. Anyway, long story short, end result of the election is that Herbert Hoover is now the president. And just a few months after Hoover takes office, this happens. The stock market collapses on Thursday, October 24th, 1929, as the result of, really a whole lot of things. A lot of rampant speculation that had been going on, the fact that farmers had been having a hard time in the 1920s, as we've mentioned before, and that the unequal distribution of wealth, the fact that so many people were, living at or below poverty, about 40% of people at this time, meant that there wasn't that much buying power. And this had become a consumer society. When no one is consuming, and you add to that the bubble that was being created by all the speculation, then you can have some major damage happen pretty quickly. And in fact, it was pretty quick. Within a 5-hour span, about $10 billion was lost on Wall Street, which is the equivalent of over $100 billion today. That's in 5 hours. And the result of this, the results unfolded pretty quickly. Within a short time, unemployment was up to 25%. Now, several years ago, back in 2008, there was a near depression, a huge economic downturn that led to some major unemployment in the U.S. And at its worst after that 2009, 2010, the unemployment rate was around 11%, not quite 12%. So if you can imagine how much worse the Great Depression was. 25%. That means, well, 1 out of every 4 people who were of working age weren't working, but that has a bigger impact than just that, right? Because even if you are one of the 3 out of 4 people who is employed, that means odds are someone in your family, maybe your immediate family, is not. So your family's suffering nonetheless. As a result of this, because so many people were out of work and there was really less money circulating, prices fell by up to 40%. And a lot of people wound up not only unemployed, but unable to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, and wound up essentially out on the street and in cities around the country, outside cities around the country. Homeless people gathered together and cobbled together these makeshift dwellings, tents, shotgun shacks. By the way, the shotgun shack, that terminology means that the wood is so thin that you could fire a shotgun into the front of the house and it would go completely through the house. So really cheap, really unsturdy building materials. And so lots of people were living in these camps that they started referring to, and not in a nice complimentary way, as Hoovervilles. Therefore, as you can see, blaming the president for the situation. Now, if you stop and think about it, Hoover took over within a few months. This happened, so it wasn't actually his fault. Although, whoever is in office when something like this happens kind of suffers the consequences of being blamed for it. Hoover is really going to have a much bigger factor, not in having caused the Depression, but in how he responds to it, how he handles it. That's what's going to wind up making him lose an enormous amount of popularity, even though he had won so overwhelmingly in the 1928 election. And here we're going to look at some of the things that Hoover did over the following 2 or 3 years that sort of ate away at his popularity. First of all, well, this isn't first of all, it's the first thing we're going to talk about, not the first thing that happened. Actually happened in 1932, which was well into Hoover's administration. In fact, it was an election year when he was running for re-election. Also happened to be really the high point or the low point, depending on how you want to look at it, of the Depression. It was the year the Depression was probably at its worst. And you had this situation where you had a large number of World War I veterans who had been promised when they signed up back in 1917, 1918, they had been promised that they would get a bonus when the war was over. And the war ended, they didn't get the bonus, and then months went by, and then years went by, then it was a new decade, and that decade was a big boom for the most part, after a slight dip right at the end of the war. The 1920s, there was a whole lot of money changing hands, and yet still, they had not gotten their promised bonus. Then the Depression happened. Now the Depression is at its worst. So a large number of these very upset veterans got together and marched on Washington. To demand the federal government do something. Well, President Hoover sent troops. He sent federal troops in to meet to cut off this march under the command of Douglas MacArthur, and serving under MacArthur on this occasion, other officers including George S. Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower, kind of like a who's who of future World War II leaders. And MacArthur made the decision that the best way to sort of pacify this crowd was to come in and beat the crap out of them. Rolled in with soldiers, armed soldiers, and there was a melee, and it really just did not look good in the newspapers at all, because these protesters are combat veterans only asking for what they had been promised. So it was a public relations disaster. Eisenhower later said, speaking of MacArthur, who again was his commander in this instance, quote, "I told that dumb son of a bitch not to go in there." Hoover was not helped by his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, and the comments that he made about the Depression and about all those unemployed people when he said, quote, speaking of the Depression, "It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up from less competent people." So, in other words, a summation of social Darwinism. This depression is going to be helpful, in essence, he was saying, because it's going to get rid of the lazy people. And it will teach people that they have to be moral and lead better lives and tighten their belts, which on probably an average good day is not the sort of thing that poor people or unemployed people want to hear. But when 1/4 of the country is unemployed, it's not a good thing at all. So that rebounded not only on Mellon, but on Hoover. There was an idea being promulgated that the best way to improve the economy is to make things better and make sure that there's more money being supplied by cutting taxes to the people at the very top. It was during this time period, the early days of the Great Depression, that Will Rogers, the humorist, actually coined the phrase trickle-down theory that you've probably heard of before, right? The idea that if you water a plant at the top, then the water trickles down and eventually reaches the entire plant. Rogers was being sarcastic in that description, because he was saying that works with plants. It doesn't work with people. With money trickles up. And even though that expression was coined in the early 1930s, it wasn't a new idea. In the 19th century, people were proposing that same idea, but there was a different term for it. It was called the horse and sparrow theory. The idea being that if you have a horse and you want to make sure that your horse is fed and you also want to feed the sparrows, you don't actually have to take grain and feed the sparrows. All you have to do is feed your horse, and then he's going to crap it out, and the birds will pick through it and find what they need to sustain them. So it's the same principle, even more insulting than the trickle-down thing, but the same basic idea. Hoover echoed this idea that people are going to have to tighten their belts. He believed that it was not the job of the government to help people, to support the people, that was the job of charities. And so in these trying times, charities should step up. People should donate more to those charities. Quote, "The government should not support the people. Federal aid weakens the sturdiness of our national character," end quote. So if you think about that for a moment, this idea of relying completely on charities, if you think about it, you'll realize that that's not going to work too well when the entire economy collapses. Why? Because no one's got the extra money to donate to charity. So right away you've got a problem. However, Hoover believed that the thing to do would be to balance the budget. Now, economists since then have pretty well across the board said that balancing the budget is something that you do when the economy is good. And then you can kind of afford to do that. When the economy's bad is the worst time to try to do that. He tried to balance the budget by pushing through tax increases, which further weakened the buying power of middle-class people. Congress actually had several proposals that involved infrastructure projects, public works, things like building roads and bridges, with the idea of the government investing in doing those things that would then create jobs, but Hoover vetoed those initiatives. As conditions worsened, he let up on that, but by then it was too little too late. He also came around finally in the third, fourth year of his presidency to the idea of extending government loans to homeowners and businesses to keep them afloat, which is something people had been calling for from the very beginning. He finally comes around to doing that, but again, it's too little too late.